delighted to welcome you to this morning's session, Cedric Robinson and the Black Radical Intellect. And the Mile High is getting my voice, and I'm only a little nervous. I'd like to begin by thanking ASA President Robert Warrior for convening this session in honor of the work and vision of Cedric J. Robinson, who passed away this summer. My deepest thanks for the kind invitation to chair the panel. I'm absolutely delighted and honored to do so. And I want to send my warmest wishes to Cedric Robinson's wife, Elizabeth Robinson, who's here with us through FaceTime, I understand. So maybe everybody say hello to Elizabeth. Hey! Who couldn't be here today, but I'm glad that she could join us via this technology. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists and mentors and friends and colleagues and comrades, allow me a few moments to situate our discussion today about Cedric Robinson, who was a mentor of mine, a member of my dissertation committee at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and someone who I admired and loved. He was perhaps, well, in some ways, I should say, Cedric's work on the Black radical tradition, on racial capitalism, on cultures of liberation should need no introduction. He was perhaps the preeminent Black radical intellectual of his generation. His foundational scholarship was critical to the development of the field of Black studies. He made original and generative contributions to political theory. He wrote what Robin D.G. Kelley, who's with us today, describes as the most original examination of the American film industry ever published. And his work gave rise to what is now known as the history of capitalism, if only now being recognized and cited for it. He was a professor of Black Studies and Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he taught for over 3 decades. Along with his wife, Elizabeth Robinson, he was a longtime co-host of the Third World News Review, a weekly television and radio show in Santa Barbara. And during this period, I would argue that he became the dean of radical Black studies and of Marxist social theory. Though not in any official capacity in the university. In the spring of 1972, Cedric was part of what was known as the Black Matters Committee, a community of Black and brown scholar activists affiliated with the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan, a collective which had organized a conference to honor the revolutionary legacy of C.L.R. James, which included a range of radical thinkers, including James himself, Sylvia Wynter, and Walter Rodney. The committee had organized itself towards the goal of building a program of study to, quote, breach the stranglehold of bourgeois thought, end quote, as Cedric explained in the opening address to the conference. In this way, they saw their task as developing what he described as categories that move. Cedric spent the next 45 years doing just that, innovating categories designed to move. In this way, Cedric was a constant dialectician, which he understood as being attendant to the opportunities for radical social change. As he puts it, quote, changes in capitalism have produced changes in Black radical politics, and they also provide new opportunities. For instance, racial capitalism in England and the US exposes the instability of race categories. In England, where South Asians are Black as well as Africans and West Indians, this created an opportunity for political alliance which were never anticipated by capitalism, end quote. While we may be in a different moment in the US in this decisive conjuncture, Cedric's point about the opportunity for alliances never anticipated by racial capitalism is absolutely crucial. After all, he explained, quote, the world is dynamic, constantly changing, constantly creating new possibilities. What will be the next phase when the rule of law becomes transparently farcical? The Christian right achieves its fascistic perfection, and the state acquires a predominantly carceral posture towards the majority of blacks, Latinos, etc., end quote. This is certainly one of the most urgent questions before us now, and I think Cedric's scholarship gives us some tools to help us in confronting the crises before us. As Cedric clarified in his last book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, Blacks and the Regimes of Race Before World War II, we have some historical choices facing us. I'm quoting him. What I wanted to stress is that racial regimes are inventions. As inventions, and this is something that I wanted the movement to hear, resistances are always leaving residues. There's going to be documentation of rebellion, resistance, outcry, end quote. I want to underscore this point that Cedric wanted social movements to hear, and that is not to leave the coexistence of oppositional and alternative relations of power unexamined. In human history, he explained, there is something always beyond the reach of dominating systems, no matter how deeply they saturate society, and that is obviously what makes change possible. And was this sense of the possibilities of social change that we so urgently need. In an interview Christina Heatherton and I conducted with Elizabeth and Cedric, he declared, at each crisis we shouldn't have survived, but we have. The current ordering of the world is so fragile. That is the lesson. In each historical moment, justice, social justice, and moral authority are questioned. They seem to be on their last legs, but that has never been the case. And he says, that's one of the lasting lessons of Black Marxism. So fortunately, we have some amazing scholars and intellectuals here today to help us think through the lessons of Cedric's work and vision in a moment where justice seems to be on its last legs, and reckon with the unfinished business of Cedric's injunction to create a program of study to break the stranglehold of bourgeois thought. Allow me to introduce each of our panelists in the order they will appear, or they appear rather, in the program. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, at the end of the table, is professor of geography in the doctoral program in earth and environmental sciences and the associate director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. From 2010 to 2011, she was president of the American Studies Association. Her book, Golden Gulag, yes, do that again, actually. Prisons, Surplus, Crisis and Opposition in Globalizing California, published by the University of California Press, was recognized by the ASA with its Laura Romero First Book Award. In 2012, the ASA honored Gilmore with its Angela Y. Davis Award for Public Scholarship. She has published and lectured widely on racial capitalism, the changing role of the state in carceral geographies, and I think she's founded a few social justice organizations along the way. Erica Edwards is a professor of English at the University of California, Riverside. She'll speak first. She specializes in African American literature, gender and sexuality, and Black political culture. She's the author of Charisma and Fictions of Black Leadership, which won the Modern Language Association's 12th annual William Sanders Scarborough Prize. Her work has been published in journals like the American Quarterly, American Literary History, Black Camera, and I'd be remiss not to note that she wrote the foreword to Cedric J. Robinson's classic text, The Terms of Order, Political Science and the Myth of Leadership, which was recently republished by the University of North Carolina Press. Christina Heatherton, next to Ruthie, is Assistant Professor of American Studies at Trinity College, co-editor of Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, which was published by Verso earlier this year, and the author of the forthcoming book, The Color Line and the Class Struggle, The Mexican Revolution, Internationalism, and the American Century, which will be published by the University of California Press. Her work appears in places like the American Quarterly, Rising Tides of Color, Race, State Violence, and Radical Movements Across the Pacific, and will appear in Feminists Rethink the Neoliberal State and the Futures of Black Radicalism. Avery Gordon here is professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, has been a visiting fellow at the Center for Research Architecture, Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths College, University of London, and I'm also proud to say was the co-chair of my dissertation committee. She is the author, not her most distinguished title. She's the author of Keeping Good Time, Reflections on Knowledge, Power, and People, and of course, Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination, among other books and articles. She's a member of the editorial working committee of the London-based journal Race and Class, and since 1997, she's been the co-host with Elizabeth Robinson of No Alibis, a weekly public affairs radio program. And I would also be remiss not to note that she wrote the preface to Cedric Robinson's An Anthropology of Marxism, published by Ashgate in 2001. So without further ado, join me in welcoming this distinguished panel.
Good morning, everyone. To say that I'm humbled to be on this panel is an understatement. And I know that there are so many of you in the room who probably have a lot to share and want to think about Cedric. So I told Jordan I'm going to move out of the way as fast as I can. So I came to Cedric Robinson's work through his people, through that magical network of colleagues and friends, and most of all, students that he taught and mentored and laughed with and argued with over the many years that he was on earth in struggle with us. I knew Cedric through his students. In fact, I met him when I was on my way to Santa Barbara for something else, and HQ was like, "Oh, you're going to Santa Barbara? Let me call Cedric and tell him you're on your way." So this thing about Cedric's work, that it travels in the academy and beyond through gestures of affiliation or a certain hapticality, is significant. It's what we see and what we might feel in this room. So if you're here at 8 a.m., I'm going to assume that you're Cedric people, and therefore I'm going to assume that we're on a first name basis. If you started graduate school around the time that I did and you weren't fortunate enough to be at UCSB with Cedric, you probably would have been introduced to his work by Robin or Ruthie or Avery or Wanima or Fred. And you probably had the UNC Press reissue of Black Marxism, the one with the pristine black matte cover and the simple blue and red geometric letters whose stark, clean lines masked what was between the book's cover. More than a history of Black Marxists, the history of the worlds of the Black radical tradition, which was, of course, before and more than Marxism. But the other material history of Cedric's work, I think, kept on shaping the social world that continued to swell around it. And by the other material history, I'm thinking of the one of the contributors to the special issue of African Identities that HQ and Tiffany, who's also here, edited in 2013, writes when they talk about how, quote, "For a long time, Black Marxism circulated underground, on the edge or over the edge of the university, for those of us who valorized being on or over that edge, even if we had been relegated to it. There, at least, we could get together and talk about the bomb that had gone off in our heads. Carrying it around as contraband, buried under the goods that legitimate parties to exchange can value, until we could get it to the black market and hand it around out of a suitcase or over a kitchen table or from behind a makeshift counter. If you had to know someone who had their hands on a copy, or you had to chance upon Black Marxism in a Black bookshop, there must have been a certain handedness that built the discursive and social field around the work. We might even call that a force field in the darkness that now, in retrospect, in the tragedy of our time, appears only slightly less obscure. I'm talking about the Reagan-Thatcher years, the post-1968 decades of prison and police buildup and privatization, the invasions of everywhere from Grenada to the Gulf, the neoliberal assault on everything that resists possession. Now, as 2016 wanes and Trump rises, I find myself turning even more urgently to Cedric and his people, Cedric people, our people, y'all on this panel, y'all in the room. And I started by returning to Tiffany's book, Waste of a White Skin, a stunning book about the history of white vulnerability and the Carnegie Corporation's Poor White Study, where Tiffany writes, as human being and the realization of human rationality and the aspiration toward and the achievement of the nation and the bureaucracy that organizes it is imagined, the racial politics that rely on Black people as the fundamental antagonists of human being and the nation must continually erect new racial regimes and forgeries of memory, of course that's Cedric's term, to paper over this relation. The study of poor whites, white poverty, and the idea that poor whites were an intractable social problem was one such racial regime, that the racialization of poor whites could occur both as privilege and misery is fundamental to the workings of this relation. So Tiffany's work and the work of Cedric and his other people is the work of Black studies as Cedric says, a critique of Western civilization, where critique signifies more than criticism, a kind of negation and other world building that is necessary for the survival of Black thought and Black being. The time for the Robinson intervention is here with us in the work of his people, and it is also here with us in its urgent demands that we stand and struggle with those of us who are protecting the water, those of us who are abolishing the prisons, those of us who are building the sanctuaries, those of us who are finding other ways to refuse the terms of our present order. The work Cedric left us is a record of radical thought, of efforts to rethink and remake the world in a historical epoch when such activity has been deemed not only dangerous or subversive by conservatives, but also naive and idealistic by leftists. And Robinson's metaphysics of the anti-political in books like The Terms of Order or in Anthropology of Marxism are not only based in Robinson's what Robin calls his deeply historical work, they're also based in the heresy, the dream worlds, the ancestral visions, the folk tales, the church life, the non-evidentiary stuff that makes up that other authority, that other call to duty that Robinson or Cedric theorizes. Against security and order, Cedric gifted us a sacred universe of disorder that confounds politics. There are two vital strands within Cedric's work that, for me, are central to how we will remember him and his work. One is what his work made most recognizable. That is, not only the history of white supremacy, but the nature of those worlds existing alongside and in negation of the culture of capital. The Black radical tradition is not simply the dialectical antithesis of capitalism or the blind spot of those movements that have posed a challenge to capitalism, such as Marxism. The Black radical tradition is, as Avery says, the living and breathing entity that stands in the place blinded from view. And the nature of that tradition is a collective consciousness informed by the history of liberation struggles and spurred by the shared sense of obligation to preserve the collective being, the ontological totality. Let us remember the claim that Cedric makes about African captives who took to the bush or who denied eating salt to sustain their belief that they could fly, as Cedric says, really fly home. While captives often attempted escape to Africa or to the maroon communities, their attempts to flee cannot be understood as simple individualistic reactions to plantation servitude. Rather, they must be understood as complete rejections of their lot, as generative instances of collective world building in the face of utter devastation and in refusal of the world that still must be refused. The work asks a profound question over and over again. What are we made of? What is all the stuff that we're made of? And what is the nature of the we that has survived the world? The other important impulse in Cedric's work that I want to remember at this occasion is its measured optimism. So at the end of Black Marxism, Cedric leaves us with a profoundly prescient statement about Black people and the New World Order. Diagnosing what he calls the degenerating mechanism of Western culture, he writes, physically and ideologically, African peoples bridge the decline of one world order and the eruption, we may surmise, of another. It is a frightful and uncertain space of being. If we are to survive, we must take nothing that is dead and choose wisely from among the dying. This was after Nixon, in the midst of Reagan, and Cedric was writing of the new world erupting into the darkness. Cedric's work across his monographs was to invite us into this frightful and uncertain place of being, moving in the profound expectation that the Western powers had already been weakened by Third World resistance and were facing their ultimate decline, even as he wrote. For so many of us in this room, Cedric's work continues teaching us in excess of itself, teaching us something about the social collective labor of our work, pushing against the headlong drive toward the professionalization of the knowledge commodity, and calling into being, into actual being, the world he imagines when he writes of that ontological totality, what I referred to as that deceptively simple creed that oppression is only one of our realities. The time for the Robinson intervention has to be now, and we must move in that same expectation that propelled it, that Western culture is degenerating and that we are the bridge to the new world order. Let us dance on ocean water. Let us take to the interior. Plan and study, as we say. Organize as we can. Protect as we must. And keep responding to the call of this giant who we will all so terribly miss as we remember.
Good morning. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the ASA for organizing this panel. I'm honored and I would say speechless to be here, but I can't be speechless because I'm supposed to say something to you all. For the unaware, nothing was amiss. In C.L.R. James's archives on the campus of the University of the West Indies in Trinidad, I was surprised to find a conference paper written by a young Cedric Robinson. C.L.R. James, after all, was not just a subject of Cedric's study. The two men knew each other, and as Jordan mentioned in his opening, in April of 1972, Cedric had brought C.L.R. James to the University of Michigan as part of the Black Matters Committee, where Cedric delivered the keynote, The Revolutionary Legacy of C.L.R. James, at an event that featured other luminaries like Robert Hill, Sylvia Wynter, and Walter Rodney. I want to reiterate this at the outset of my comments because in remembering Cedric Robinson today, we must note that he was present at the birth of Black Studies, not only its formal institutional inception on college campuses, but as Robin D.G. Kelley has recently described, at the initial stirrings of its intellectual formations, which occurred outside of colleges, in the organizing efforts and global consciousness of people engaged in struggle, and as Cedric described in the quote, daily encounters and petty resistances to domination, the necessary routine practices which ultimately lent themselves to the preparation for more epic resistance movements. As a scholar, but also as an organizer and an activist, and as a careful observer in the global context of decolonization, Cedric was able to recognize a Black radical tradition, which he described as an accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle. Like James, Cedric Robinson was a renegade radical thinker, one who rejected the path of the traditional intellectual he was trained to become because he refused the objectives of the class whose dominance he was trained to reproduce. Writing in the preface of the Black Jacobins, James excoriates the bourgeois intellectuals who missed the world before them, noting, quote, "They wrote so well because they saw so little." In Black Marxism, Cedric elegantly dispatches with the racialist, Eurocentric, and ruling class historiographies which systematically failed to comprehend Black insurgency, writing, "For the unaware, nothing was amiss." Over the past few months, I've been thinking about Cedric and C.L.R. James's archive because I have been struggling with the enormous task of being a part of this panel and commemorating Cedric's life and work. In that archive, I was moved to find photographs of James's funeral, a massive celebration organized by the oil workers of Trinidad, who can be seen pouring through the streets in powerful commemoration of a man they claimed as their own. Like James, Cedric Robinson was a man claimed by many. It's an honor for me to speak to you here today among his friends, his students, and colleagues, and I also recognize that there are many people who could be standing in my place. I hope to honor him and honor them with my comments today. It's strange to be at the ASA without Cedric. If James was flanked by oil workers, Cedric was flanked by a loving and fierce entourage that always included HQ, HLT Kwan, Crystal A. Griffith, Tiffany Willoughby Herard, and in other events, Francoise Cromer, who he affectionately called Frankie, and always with his wife and partner, Elizabeth Robinson. At Cedric's memorial, Jean Shepherd stood up to say that we have to acknowledge that even though Cedric did not teach queer theory or gender studies, he produced more queer women scholars of color than many senior scholars who did. So let's acknowledge that. Cedric's generosity as a mentor, especially to young scholars of color, persisted long after his retirement, and many of us worked with him in his capacity as an emeritus scholar. When we complained about the failure of finding a home in the university, Cedric often offered us gentle admonition. As he once told his student at UCSB, Jonathan Gomez, "You're searching for love in a place that doesn't love you. What are you going to do to create the spaces that do?" Is there really church music playing behind me as I said that? I didn't plan that. Last night, Robert Warrior had us wrestle with the notion of home. In his life, as in his work, Cedric thought deeply, I'd argue, about this question and the potential of marronage, the quilombos, the communities of African fugitive slaves who often joined forces with indigenous communities throughout the Americas and Africa as underappreciated sites of insurgency. In these fugitive spaces, people could make a home in a world not yet possible, what C.L.R. James called a future in the present. In his life, as in his work, Cedric built a home with Elizabeth that offered similar solace and possibility. This was a place where runaways, misfits, and people who didn't easily belong elsewhere, like myself, found a home. Okay, let me tell a joke so I can get over this emotional situation. There were people of so many different ages and backgrounds and walks of life who passed through the Robinsons' home that when a social worker came to check on Cedric's hospice care, she walked in and exclaimed aloud, "Is this a group home or something?" I make this point at the request of Cedric's daughter, Najda, who asked that we remember her father not only for his work, but for how he was as a person. His insights came from his life and how he lived it. He was a rare scholar who consistently showed up. He gave many of us support, love, and recognition. And this, as much as the brilliance of his insights, gave many of us the courage to follow his lead, the courage to have what several of his students have named a modest audacity. It's strange to be living in this new moment of Trump without the benefit of Cedric's wisdom, especially on the question of race, when at this moment to call out racism often means you are accused of racializing the situation. I don't know how this verbal jujitsu works, but it's like, the world's turning upside down. Cedric, of course, thought deeply about race, racism, racialism, and racialization, a deft grammar that we must recover before we lose the legitimacy to speak it. He always brought our attention to the processes of race-making, which naturalized the social order and predetermined the social relations of capitalism. We could stand to recover the fluidity of his formulations, his understanding of race as a conceit, one with material consequences whose installation provides the pretext for domination. Cedric was fond of quoting his dear friend Otis Madison, who passed a few months before Cedric did, who said, quote, "The purpose of racism is to control the behavior of white people, not black people. For blacks, guns and tanks are sufficient. I wonder how we might gain a fuller understanding of the present if we think with Cedric of whiteness as an unstable category requiring continual repair and reinvention, that racism does not benefit poor whites. Rather, it is the mechanism used to control them. Cedric was incredibly generous to me in helping me think through my dissertation on radical internationalism related to the Mexican Revolution and the color line. He contributed an essay to a small volume I edited called Downtown Blues, a Skid Row Reader, about the militarization and removal of poor black people in Skid Row, Los Angeles. There, as in Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, he offers a film analysis of the movie The Soloist, a wretched film, full stop. Cedric offers a masterful takedown of the racial regimes, of how the discursive production of expendability of black people in Skid Row preceded and authorized the physical removal of those people by the state and police forces. He compared the film to the jungle films of the early 20th century, adding, quote, "But we should expect that to some degree the West arrogance had dissipated in the intervening 100 years. Classic Cedric Robinson. In 2014, actually 2 years to the date today, Ruthie, Gilmore, Jordan Camp, and I organized a conference inspired by his work, which brought together thinkers like Barbara Ransby, Nikhil Pal-Singh, Jack O'Dell, Avery Gordon, Paul Ortiz, Robin Kelly, Françoise Vergès, Tulani Davis, Ani Mukherjee, Angela Y. Davis, Gina Dent, and Elizabeth Robinson in order to confront racial capitalism. The event was called Confronting Racial Capitalism. Yeah, we're going to need a lot of those. This event was suggestive of new directions and dimensions in his scholarship, and I think there's more to be done in this respect, and I want to offer just a few directions. How, for example, do we think about the ways in which Cedric Robinson grappled with world systems? At SUNY Binghamton, along with his colleagues Giovanni Arrighi, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Annabelle Quijano, and Terrence Hopkins, how did they influence him, and how did he influence them? How do we make sense of the impact of the Cold War on his formulations and the, quote, fear of the left, as he called it, that permeated the US at the time he wrote Black Marxism? It's worth thinking about his links in England and the impact it had on his theorization of race, of the Irish radicals he met there who were inspired by Black freedom struggles. Besides C.L.R. James, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Richard Wright, less has been written on the ways in which Cedric grappled with other key figures, Frantz Fanon, Emile Cabral, and what he thought their historiographies got wrong. There's much more to be understood about his relationship to the Institute of Race Relations and the journal Race and Class, where he worked out many of these ideas in dialogue with radical thinkers like A. Sivanandan, Jenny Bourne, Colin Prescott, Hazel Waters, especially in the political context of London in the 1980s, where, as Sivanandan famously articulated, black was a political color. How do we make sense of the transnational context of liberation struggles within which Cedric consistently understood the US context? I think there's more to be learned about the Third World News Review radio and TV program that he co-hosted with Elizabeth. I know at least one person, Ani Mukherjee, who grew up watching and listening to Cedric and Elizabeth. The show convinced them that there was another world beyond the racist beach towns of Santa Barbara and Goleta possible, and such exposure encouraged him to become a formidable scholar of anti-racist radical movements himself. Elizabeth Robinson has continually made the point that Cedric's work is not supposed to exist. She said in the interview that Jordan mentioned earlier, "This work will be buried unless there are people like all of you who are refusing to let it happen. The Academy is not amenable to scholarship like this. It's not amenable to things that are meant to be transforming," unquote. The surest way to obsolescence is hagiography. I hope we can wrestle with Cedric's work and his contributions, build on it, disagree with it, treat him like the formidable intellect that he was, with scholarship producing new insights and new questions. There's undoubtedly more to uncover. In this two-part interview that Jordan and I did that will appear in a volume co-edited by Gay Johnson and Alex Lubin, we didn't know this at the time, but this will be the last public record of Cedric's thought before he lost the power of speech. I asked Cedric to reflect on the visions of liberation articulated in the Black radical tradition in the present moment. And he describes the necessity of developing a, quote, method of understanding the world around you. I'm going to repeat a quote that Jordan stole some of, but I think it's worth repeating. Our communities are marvelous phenomena. In a sense, the totalities that we have experienced historically have each, at the moment, seemed unassailable. At each crisis, we shouldn't have survived, but we have. The current ordering of the world is so fragile. That is the lesson. In each historical moment, justice, social justice, and moral authority are questions. They seem to be on their last leg, but it has never proven to be the case. I'd like to close with a short poem I wrote after Cedric's funeral. There was a massive fire in Santa Barbara that day that we couldn't see at the time. But when we walked outside, the sun was shining, and with the falling ash, it looked like it was snowing. We said goodbye to Cedric, his hat and pipe on the table. Outside, ash fell softly from the sky. A fire was raging by the ocean. It swallowed the night in smoke until the moon blinked red. Cedric showed us how to pair rage with forgiveness, to smooth our passions into a calm that would not consume us, to laugh, to keep from crying. He taught many of us how to fight and how to win, not with violence, but with a patience that could quietly eclipse the sky. For the unaware, nothing was amiss. Rest in power, Cedric J. Robinson.
Good morning, everybody. Let me add my thanks to Robert Warrior for organizing this panel and to everybody who also got up so early. I'm trying to see, there might be a couple of seats for those of you standing by the door if you want to come through. There's definitely a chair here, a couple of chairs there. Of course, I wish I was gathered with this wonderful group of people under different circumstances, but nevertheless, I'm very glad to be with you all this morning. Cedric Robinson and also Elizabeth Robinson, too, have been my friends and colleagues for almost 30 years. And so it's hard for me to take the measure of that as a personal loss, and I think I will not do that this morning. But I will, I think, sound some similar themes to what you've already heard this morning, but perhaps in a bit more cranky way, which is my want as the teacher of many of these people and not the student. Since Cedric passed away, no, this is, yeah, just to, the launch is a little rough here. Since Cedric passed away, I've seen and read many beautiful tributes. I just heard some more. And also a lot of intelligent comments about his work, but I've also unfortunately encountered some foolishness and also some opportunism. And at the risk of sounding both possessive and also churlish, especially at this hour in the morning, I would like to remind everyone, because it's also, I think, for me, a way of being mindful, especially as I am on these panels. I was just in London last week doing 3 events also honoring Cedric. That for most of Cedric Robinson's professional life, his writing was neither recognized nor appreciated, except by a very small number of individuals, the Cedric people, that Erica called them. And his everyday work life was done within a university with whom he had to fight for everything: his PhD, his tenure, his authority to co-direct his own Black Studies department in the rich directions that he envisioned, and so on. I think this is very important not to forget. Anyone who comes to the recognition that they earlier deserved late, of course, has to deal with the legacy of their marginalization, a situation that's made much more difficult when that person is no longer living and so can't control or contradict, of course, what's said about them. Because trivialization and marginalization are part of the history of Black scholarship, especially Black radical scholarship, Late or posthumous validation is welcome, but it's also easier and so susceptible to all kinds of misdirection, misappropriation, and misuse. Cedric Robinson was unusual in a profession overpopulated by sensitive egos. In his genuine lack of interest, there are a lot of us in this room, I would say, by his genuine lack of interest in conventional forms of professional recognition and advancement, which meant both that he was somewhat clueless about certain things and in lucky compensation that he never developed the kind of bitterness or narcissism that can also be common in a competitive competitive and evaluative profession like ours, more and more dominated by celebrity. This lack of interest was very pronounced in Cedric's personality or his bearing as a person, a very present absence, you could say, defining very much his thought and his behavior as a scholar and as a teacher. His attention was always elsewhere, directed towards and grounded, to quote Gay Johnson, in his quote, refusal to merely celebrate or describe Black radicalism, calling us instead to a recognition of an engagement with the insistence of Black radical actors upon an uncompromising liberation from all forms of oppression, a labor, she continues, made more difficult by allies whose proposals often reflected a bourgeois construction of class struggle. As we celebrate and honor Cedric Robinson's legacy, it would be wise for us to remember what he valued and how he embodied those values in practice. I believe he said to Chuck Morse in 1999, quote, that the historical struggles in Africa and the New World called some of the best virtues of their native cultures. One such virtue was democracy, the commitment to a social order in which no voice was greater than another. That said, I'd like to make 2 points about Robinson's work that might be especially relevant for American studies scholars, especially for people who are new to Cedric's work. First, Cedric spent a lot of time and energy elaborating a Black radical tradition, as you've already heard, bound to a capacious dialectic of power and resistance to its abuses, a historical materialism grounded in the primacy of social struggle. This historical materialism drives the revisionist account of the rise of the West in the book for which he is best known, Black Marxism. It reappears in An Anthropology of Marxism, the book that is perhaps his least well-known book, where it rebukes Marxism's limitations on the, quote, warrant, a favorite word of Cedric's, that domination and oppression inspire what he called an irrepressible socialism generated by peasants, slaves, workers, and intellectuals in both the metropole and the periphery. This historical materialism of social struggle opens and defines Black movements in America, where Robinson writes, quote, when Black resistance surfaced, its character insinuated itself into the unstable contradictions of an immigrant, slave, servant, and imperial social order, a, quote, cauldron, in which slaves, indigenous peoples, and the Euro-American poor had to be deliberately and violently pried apart. And it is given expression later in that book when Cedric uses Frantz Fanon's words to describe the cultures of Black radicalism in the US. And I quote, this is Fanon, it was not, Fanon wrote, the organization of production, but the persistence and organization of oppression, which form the primary social basis of revolutionary activity. If we're looking for the primary basis of the production of social wealth, we might look elsewhere. This seems to me an especially important legacy for American studies, where an intersectional rather than a singular or ethno-nationalist understanding of the world has been fought for and finally welcomed, as you heard last night in Robert Warrior's really unapologetic address on that point. I was really happy for that. It suggests a way of reading one of the currently most often quoted terms of Cedric, which Erica mentioned earlier, ontological totality, and situating that particular consciousness and culture in the capacious materialism of social struggle as it emerges and recedes historically in what Lisa Lowe calls the intimacy of four continents, And may I say that I think Lisa's extraordinary book is perhaps one of the most important contemporary serious engagements with Robinson's historiography, and anyone who hasn't read that might. And if you're interested in the Robinsonian legacy, that's another point for you. Perhaps this dialectic also suggests a way of reading Fanon, who is getting considerable attention again. I highly recommend, if you haven't read it, Cedric's 1993 scathing critique of, quote, the appropriation of Franz Fanon, a critique of Fanon and his appropriators launched by the problems with treating Fanon as a, quote, background device in, quote, self-referential academic debates, and in consequence failing to understand that in Black Skins, White Masks, Fanon, and I quote Cedric here, quote, mistook a racial subject for his own class, those he termed the nationalist bourgeoisie, unquote. Cedric Robinson never ceased to remind anyone who was asking or listening that the Black radical tradition with which he was associated is as much an invention as it was a discovery of something already there and fully formed, even if part of the struggle was in fact to make it obvious that its collective and contentious intelligence was there living and breathing in Western civilization's blind field. The Black radical tradition of the Black radical internationalist tradition, to use Barbara Ransby's, I think, more accurate naming of the tradition with which Robinson was associated, is a living tradition that changes and takes shape as it opposes and negates racial, class, and gender regimes that themselves mutate. At the conference, Confronting Racial Capitalism, the Black Radical Tradition and Cultures of Liberation, which I'm not sure who mentioned it already this morning, Christina, that was held in New York and organized by Jordan, Christina, and Ruthie. Cedric nominated the word ideology as the tradition's watchword. He said, with a somewhat sharp breath, if I recall, quote, it's not experience that frames our conduct, but ideology. Perhaps it is more accurate to say that it is what we do with our experience that matters. Bound initially by the prism of his own class, Robinson concludes his article on Fanon. Fanon, quote, had begun to imagine conceptually and theoretically the modern world system outside the seductive deceits appropriated and enforced by his class. Which brings me to my second point, or really, because there's just a little bit of time left, the start of a point. In his tribute published in Counterpunch, Robin Kelly notes that Robinson did not see Black Marxism as a, quote, sacred text. As I suggested at the start, I think it unlikely Cedric Robinson would see any book he wrote that way. And obviously, he wrote other books and continued to refine his thinking on Black resistance and radicalism in Black movements in America, on the problems of Marxism and an anthropology of Marxism, and on racial capitalism in the last book, Forgeries of Myth and Meaning, on Blacks and the regimes of race in American theater and film before World War II. As more and more scholars become aware of Cedric Robinson's work, I hope they will actually read it. The new edition of Robinson's first book, I did say I was going to be a little cranky this morning. It's early. Yeah, okay. The new edition of Robinson's first book, Terms of Order, Political Science and the Myth of Leadership, with the wonderful introduction by Erica Edwards, will help tremendously as she has brought her own intelligence and audience to it, as will hopefully the dissemination of these kind of wonderful comments and people answering some of Christina's great questions she left us with for research and further study. I would like to end by making a pitch for American studies scholars in particular to give forgeries the attention it deserves and has not yet had. For this is very much a book about ideology, culture, and racial capitalism, our terrain. In this book, Cedric Robinson explicitly articulated his notion of a racial regime, that unstable and, quote, chaotic makeshift patchwork of race, quote, masquerading as memory and the immutable, that, quote, justifies relations of power, and he analyzed in that book the ways that American capitalism determined the construction of successive racial regimes that were publicized by film in its early years. Racial regimes, Robinson argued, change or mutate because they degenerate. One reason they degenerate is because they exclude parts of reality that destabilize the purposes to which they are put. One reality that has consistently destabilized racial regimes is the Black radical tradition. The arc that links Black Marxism to forgeries is here, as multiple sites and uses of cultures collide. And I quote from famous passage at the end of Black Marxism, or the middle sort of end, quote, "The Black radical tradition casts doubt on the extent to which capitalism penetrated and reformed social life and on its ability to create entirely new categories of human experience stripped bare of consciousness and culture." Perhaps the indigenous radical tradition would teach us that well. You might recall probably the most important, to my mind, pithy sentence in all of that book, in all of Black Marxism, and that sentence is, "The cargo had consciousness." This lesson about the reality of the fugitive reality in which many of us live is one Robinson was always at pains to share. And it is perhaps the most appropriate one in this particular moment, in which the masquerade of US national identity and populist presidential power looks and sounds much like it did when D.W. Griffith's 1915 film Birth of a Nation, the subject of Forgery's brilliant Chapter 2, helped to advertise a new post-slavery racial regime of what Cedric Robinson called, and I quote, "virile whiteness," that also hysterically promised to suture political economic crisis to the fortunes of a violent and fragile ethno-nationalism. As Robinson might say, that effort was met by a struggle well prepared and forged in a collective intelligence passed on through the generations, and this one will be too, I'm sure. For if there's one claim Robinson made that seems to have been repeatedly confirmed, it is that the persistence of the human spirit, those, quote, "irrepressible resistances which are the inevitable companions to oppression." That's his last words. Thank you.
All these devices up here so that I can do this. That's on? All right, good morning. Thank you all for coming out today. Thank you, Robbie Warrior, for organizing this panel at the 11th hour. Thank you, dear, beloved colleagues, for making me cry already. I'm going to continue with Cranky and Churlish. The old people, we're taking advantage of our gray hair. Avery's are disguised. It's true. I mean, come on. All right, here we go. So I'm going to talk and read. And the kind of great moments of my encounters with Cedric Robinson over almost 30 years were bookended by conferences. The first conference, the first day I actually met him, was at a conference in Claremont, California that I co-organized with Sid Lamel at the Claremont Colleges. And it was called Pan-Africanism Revisited, Liberation Movements in Africa and the Diaspora. And it was actually the greatest conference I ever attended. And it's not because I co-organized it, but because of the people who came together. And actually my dear friend Sid's vision. I also met Robin Kelly the same morning. He was fresh out of graduate school, man, wet behind the ears. And Cedric gave a talk on a panel in which the co-panelist had absorbed all of the time. This guy talked and talked and talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. And I stood in the back of the room and I had his check, his honorarium check in my hand, and I started tearing it. Beginning with the remittance advice, and he was not daunted. He just kept talking. That gave Cedric only about 5 minutes to give his 20 or 25-minute presentation. And Cedric blew me away. He graciously and clearly and eloquently and calmly and with his characteristic humor that always took you a beat before you realized it was a joke to catch, gave his entire paper and sat down. So I wanted to give both checks to Cedric, but I couldn't do it. So having met Cedric then in 1988, it was my 38th birthday, 36th birthday. I don't know, I was in my late 30s. I was driven to read and try to learn to understand Black Marxism. And what I didn't understand at first was how that book was not only a retelling of history, a critique of Western civilization, including a critique of how Western civilization tells its story of itself to itself and projects it to the world. But it's also a book in which invention takes form and shape on every page. So that once we go through the many, many chapters that correct history and show from page 2 on that racial capitalism was racial when the participants in that mode of production were all people, all of whose descendants might have become white, right? That's page 2. So if you're not going to read the whole book, read the first 2 pages. That the invention of racial capitalism's story of itself is countered in that book by a different kind of inventiveness. And then, therefore, in the case studies of Du Bois and James and Wright, we see the iteration or the reiteration of invention as those stories unfold. And one of my students, Sam Stein, asked me the other day, we just read this book in my seminar, he said, is Robinson inventing himself as he's telling of these intellectuals' inventions and reinventions? And I said, yes, absolutely. And that's how we must read this book, not as a fixed or finished text, but rather as something through which we can find the inventive capacity to do and think what we need to do and think. So I'm going to read you a little bit from the chapter that I've put in the book that Gay Johnson and Alex Lubin have edited that will be coming out from Verso. And this is just to exemplify how Cedric Robinson's teaching taught me how to think. So just bear with me. This is called Money. Loot, pay, wage, profit, interest, tax, rent, accumulation, extraction, colonialism, imperialism. The modern prison is a central but by no means singularly defining institution of carceral geographies in the United States and beyond. Geographies that signify regional accumulation strategies and upheavals, immensities and fragmentations that reconstitute in space-time, even if geometrically the coordinates are unchanged, to run another round of accumulation. Prison rose in tandem with a world historical transition in the role of money in everyday life. In retrospect, the transformation looks just like a flip. From having been, as for most people it continues to be, a means to move stored energy between sellers and buyers of desired objects, money became the desirable end, not for hoarders and misers' erotic caresses, but to touch differently and not for too long, to enliven through pressing into imperative motion, irregular but perpetual cycles of transformation to make money more. Capitalism, never not racial, including in rural England or anywhere in Europe for that matter, where, as Cedric teaches us, hierarchies among people whose descendants might all have become white depended for their structure on group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, exploited by elites as part of all equally exploitable nature as other to justify inequality at the end of the day and next morning as well. Racial capitalism, a mode of production developed in agriculture, improved by enclosure in the Old World, and captive land and labor in the Americas, perfected in slavery's time, motion, field, factory choreography. Its imperative forged on the anvils of imperial war-making monarchs, and their tributary peers who had to ante up taxes in cash, not kind, so the sovereign might arm increasingly centralized and regularized militaries who became less able to pay themselves, as they had in the past, by looting at each battle's end. Not that they stopped looting later or now. Nor did the pay packet come all at once. In the USA, many 19th century citizen soldiers went to their graves, still waiting to be paid for having killed or agreed to kill Native Americans or French or their proxies. The compensation took the form of something that could be transformed to something else, either title to looted land and honor for the vast Herrenvolk peerage of enfranchised white men, land, a good that can't be moved, though a deed can be pocketed or sold or borrowed against or seized for a lien, in other words, turned into money. And if not a title, a pension, an entitlement, paid out regularly as money to ease golden years. Indeed, modern prisons were born alongside and grew up with the United States of America. Penitentiaries established state-making at the margin in the early republic, where every founding document recapitulated free as against other, imported as against immigrated, to clarify the sweeping ideals of defense and general welfare long before the 13th Amendment had no universal remit, but rather defined in the earliest pages who was in and who was out. Then, as now, competing concepts of freedom shaped planetary movements of people and relationships. Like lives, early sentences were short, absorbing one by one people who wouldn't toe their assigned line or presumed line, play their part, hit their mark in racial capitalism's dramatically scaled cycles of placemaking, including all of chattel slavery, imperialism, settler colonialism, resource extraction, infrastructural coordination, urban industrialization, regional development, and the financialization of everything. Racial capitalism's extensive and intensive animating force, its contradictory consciousness, its means to turn objects and desires into money, is people in the prime of life, or younger, people who make, move, grow, and care for things and other people. Who then was or is out of place? Unfree people who sold things they made or grew on the side, hiding the money in an emancipation pot. People who couldn't say where they work or prove that they're free, or show a ticket or a pass, a document to save their skin, or save themselves from the narrative that their skin, stretched in particular ways across muscles and bones, seems to suggest about where they shouldn't be. Racial capitalism's imperative requires all kinds of scheming, including hard work by elites and their comprador cohorts in the overlapping and interlocking space economies of the planet's surface. They build and dismantle and refigure states, moving capacity into and out of the public realm. And they think very hard about money on the move. In the contemporary world, when product cycles and profit cycles turn faster and faster, racial capitalism, ever less patient with any friction on money flow, sticking resources in prisons where they might not emerge on time and in quality required isn't all that attractive, even though the cages are full of millions of people in the prime of life. We used to think that in the USA, contemporary mass incarceration, mass unfreedom, racially organized, must be a recapitulation of slavery's money-making scheme. But if these massive carceral institutions, weighted like cities, are not factories and service centers, then where's the profit, the surplus money at the end of the day? Today's prisons are extractive. What does that mean? It means prisons enable money to move because of the enforced inactivity of people locked in them. It means people extracted from communities and people returned to communities but not entitled to be of them enable the circulation of money on rapid cycles. What's extracted from the extracted is the resource of life, time. If we think about this dynamic through the politics of scale, understanding bodies as places, then criminalization transforms individuals into tiny territories primed for extractive activity to unfold. Extracting again time from the territories of selves. This process opens a hole in a life, furthering, perhaps to our surprise, the annihilation of space by time. A stolen and corrupted social wage flies through that time hole to prison employees' paychecks, to vendors, to utility companies, to contractors, to debt service. The cash takes many final forms: wages, interest, rent, and sometimes profit. But more to the point, the extractive process brings the mechanics of contemporary imperialism to mind. Extraction in money form from direct producers whose communities are destabilized too. But money too gives us some insight into the enormity of the possible inhabitants and makers of abolition geographies. Abolition geography, the antagonistic contradiction of carceral geographies, forms an interlocking pattern across the terrain of racial capitalism. We see it. Now, as Avery was saying earlier, many people have, for whatever reasons, some good, not so good, have taken up Cedric Robinson's work in an extremely constricted way. They steal it, or they reify it, very much, to use the phrase that Jordan used earlier, shaped by the stranglehold of bourgeois thought, which shapes a lot of so-called radical thought. So what I find in many encounters with people's alleged encounter with Cedric's work are two things. Either people step forward thinking they're going to correct his work, complicate it, by showing something about racial capitalism that is already there in the concept because the concept moves, or they're embarrassed by it. They're embarrassed by it. One of the reasons that people don't read and use Robinson's work is they find it embarrassing. They are embarrassed by the concept, ontological totality. They're embarrassed by the section in terms of order, where Robinson, having gone through all of the conceits of political science, turns to the joker, using anthropology and an ethnographic account of power and difference in a Southern African ethnic grouping to say, here's another way of looking at things. I presented that chapter of that book in a research seminar of self-styled radicals, and they find it embarrassing. They're embarrassed. Why is that? How is that? So when Elizabeth Robinson says we have to take this work up, it's not only because the work is crucial for us to be alive, it's also because I think in that rejection, that embarrassment, that refusal to take seriously that if the dialectics of freedom is organized through many, 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 many kinds of contradictions that all cohere somewhat incoherently as racial capitalism, then if we can be embarrassed into an inability to think, then we will never, ever, ever, ever win. The other conference that bookended my relationship with Cedric was the one that Jordan and Christina and I organized in New York in 2014, almost exactly 2 years ago today, right? And it was there that Cedric corrected me. So Avery gave the nicer version of Cedric's critique of the notion of experience being the form through which subjectivity emerges. And we were sitting on stage together, he and Robin and I, the big opening plenary, and we were in a room that was beautifully lit, and it was filmed, and we were feeling very happy that we had managed to shoehorn twice the number of people into the room that the room could legally hold. It was great. Anyway, toward the end of our event, we'd all given our talks, and we'd been doing Q&A with a very, very engaged audience. I pulled out of my memory my favorite line from Capital Volume 1, in which Marx says, by mixing our labor with the earth, we change the external world and thereby change our own nature. I love that. Cedric turned to me. He wasn't just sharp, he hit me. He hit me. He thwacked me on the arm. He said, I've been trying to tell you, it's not experience, it's consciousness. It's consciousness. It's consciousness. So as we go forward in our work, we must take seriously the fact that consciousness is what matters. It's not the fact that I can stand in front of this room and say these things into the room. Many colleagues have stopped me in the few days that we've been here and have said, oh, Trump, what can we do? If only we'd had them in our classes. We did. We absolutely did. And we know it. It's not a lack of education. It's not facts. It's consciousness. So in our work as intellectuals, whatever our day jobs are, what we're constrained to do now is to work through the impulse to correct and work through the terror of embarrassment and develop, forge, and extend the consciousness through which I think we can get free. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those wonderful presentations, and I would not even dare try to add a thing to them. But what I do want to do is open up to questions. We are being filmed by the ASA, and this is going to be circulated widely on YouTube, and I think will be an important archive not only for other scholars to study, but for the movements. So what I'll ask you to do in that spirit of archiving, you know, the radical tradition, if you like, is to speak very loudly, and then I'm going to repeat your questions, and then you all are, you know, going to have to come up to the mic in order to answer them. So hope it's not too clumsy and that you'll kind of bear with us. So with that, please, questions. Or comments. I mean, let me just echo what a lot of people said. There's tons of friends, students, colleagues, people who've written about Cedric. So, you know, you're also welcome to just make statements. Not everybody at once, though. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question, and this is like fast forwarding to kind of, I'm really interested in getting the panel's point of view, individually or collectively, on how do we navigate and understand and forge through this embarrassment to create a space for folks to be woke, to be conscious. And so it's easy to preach in a bubble and to preach around folks that we kind of agree with, but how do we forge that, and kind of how do we find kind of that balance in inviting people into this space, which is very difficult, right? And so how do we do this?
Yeah, so the question, just to summarize, is how do we navigate this embarrassment? How do we reach a kind of broader audience and bring people into a necessary conversation? Anyone want to take that up? Should we take two or three at a time, and then I'll pass the mic? Yeah? Is there, if there is another question? Yes? Come closer and say whatever you're wondering. Just a little bit closer to the mic.
I just was wondering about this, I don't know, sort of singular appeal that Cedric and his work had. I mean, and we're in history, and we were like, where are our people, and why is he not our people? It was kind of a disheartening morning, I have to say. So I don't know, I'm kind of interested in that, in talking about, and maybe it's this embarrassment piece. I thought that seemed to really resonate for me. So I don't know, I'm just interested in in hearing what folks think, you know, and I identify as a historian. You know, I don't have issues with it. But I'm just like, what's the problem? And a black historian, I'm just like, what's the problem? So anyway.
Thanks for that. Yeah, Ori, could you come up and speak into the mic?
Hi, thanks again for a fantastic panel. One of the things that Robinson talks about is how the Black radical tradition developed this without necessarily having a consciousness of itself as such. And I think now that we're in a different moment, clearly so many people are here, we're talking about the tradition, we're thinking about how to expand it, and I guess I'm wondering what are the potential dangers of carrying on that project in a moment where we're actually very conscious of this as a particular project, and a project that is gaining traction within sort of formal scholarship.
Thanks for that. So I'll just pass the mic.
I always totally want to say something. Thank you for all of those questions. I cut something that I'm just going to share with you because there's time. All right, so in my view, the Black radical tradition is an accumulation, a constantly evolving accumulation of structures of feeling, whose individual and collective narrative arcs persistently tend toward freedom. It's a way of mindful action that is constantly renewed and refreshed over time, but maintains its strength, its speed, its stamina, agility, flexibility, and balance. The great explosions and distortions of modernity put into motion novel as well as already existing understandings of difference, possession, dependence, and abundance. So, you know, that's what the tradition is, rather than a checklist of people and a checklist of modalities. So I think then, to answer the question, is to think, for us to think in all of the work that we already do. Like, nobody has to change what their specialty is. In all of the work that we already do, is to think, you know, to stretch to the something beyond and ask what underlies this kind of accumulation, right? What is it that people are doing, whether they're at Standing Rock or in households, you know, cowering from, you know, police onslaughts or wherever. What is it that people are doing? And then how can we imagine and work with what I've been calling work from, really, the infrastructure of feeling, which is what underlies these structures of feeling that tend toward freedom rather than tend toward hopelessness. Because while the Black radical tradition wasn't made from racial capitalism, there are plenty of people whose sense of possibility and futurity is shaped, which is, say, foreshortened by racial capitalism. So they're, you know, sort of finding our way into that opening matters. And the final thing I want to say, and this is related to Paula's question, is a whole lot of people think that Black Marxism is a book about Marxists who are Black. They really do. And so it's essentially what I think we're all talking about is developing quite self-consciously now, because we have to, a kind of an aspirational, it's the word that Christina used in a talk the other day, or counter-aspirational subjectivity, an analytical disposition, and a sense of how to organize system-changing outcomes. Like, this is the stuff, no matter what we do, right? And everybody knows how to do something. It's not like everybody has to retool. Cedric did that TV show with Elizabeth for all those years. He knew how to sit and talk. He was, you know, an intellectual. And listen, and listen, and listen, and listen.
I think everything you said, Ruthie, is good, and I think it's also just more simple than that, too. That it's just, this is about doing the work. I mean, there's no promise of an outcome in advance of it. So You know, the teaching and the organizing, this is how it works. And I think that's something that was very much in play in Cedric's practice, as I think a number of his students are here and can say. You just got to do it. And so the work that's partially involved for scholars is to read his work and to try to understand what it can mean for you and what you're doing. At the lectures that he gave at Irvine in 2012, yeah, he made a point of pounding on the table a couple of times and saying, only the promise of liberation, only the promise of liberation. This is all the Black radical tradition promises, is just that promise. And so that's the nature of social struggle. I think that's just it.
I came to Cedric with a lot of questions about W.E.B. Du Bois. He's a key theorist in the book I'm writing, and he's someone who I treat as a theorist, as someone who's thinking productively and generatively about the color line. And in the process of thinking about Du Bois, I've been really stunned in going through his scholarship at how everybody has their own Du Bois. You know, he can signify something in different periods of history. He can stand in a fixed way at different political moments for different political interventions he did have. But there's, you know, somewhat of an unwillingness to think about the totality of his thought. In other words, to think about him as a theorist. And in thinking through Du Bois, and now in thinking through Cedric and other figures, I've been contemplating putting together a piece called The Floating Signification of Black Radicalism, just to be able to make sense of this unwillingness to treat some of these figures as theorists. And so in answer to some of the questions on the table, I suppose I have a kind of twofold answer. You know, one, I think some of the embarrassment and hostility just stems from outright racism. I've been in seminar rooms, as I'm sure many of you have, where, you know, you try to work through some of Cedric's work, and the resistance, the refusal to engage with it, it comes almost from a different register. You know, in the seminar room I was in, people had the chapters mixed up. We were supposed to read like chapters 6 and 8, and, you know, people had read 5 and 3 or something, and people made the point, well, does it really matter? I mean, it's all saying the same thing, basically, right? And so, you know, there's a kind of incredulity just in terms of, you know, from the outside looking in, there's a refusal to think about anti-racist scholarship because people think racism's easy. It's just bad, and all we do is wake up at 8 in the freaking morning to talk about how bad it is, that it's a question of enumeration, not theorization. So it's something to confront from the outside looking in, racism, but that's not the only problem. From the inside looking out, I suppose, I want to say, you know, our injunction is to recover Robinson as a theorist, to be able to work through him, the totality of his thought, the shifting, developing nature of it, the way we do any other theorist that we, you know, take seriously and imagine. I mean, you know, people will say, well, the young Mark said this and the old Mark said that, you know, and you can call upon different theorists without an understanding that whatever insight you bring up stands in for the totality of their intervention. And for some reason, there's a fragility with which we deal with Cedric Robinson's work. It's almost more comfortable for it to just register at the level of the symbolic, because it's almost as if to touch the contradictions would be to compromise it in some way. And as scholars, as theorists, we have to refuse it. We have to take them seriously, and I think that's one thing we can all do.
There's this great line towards the end of Cedric's preface to the Terms of Order, where he's talking about the traditions of thought, and particularly the Western social sciences, that have made it almost impossible to even study a thing like the Black radical tradition. And he says at the end of the preface that I intend to abuse the social sciences, or something like that. And so I think one of the greatest contributions of his work is to, in fact, embarrass the disciplines. And in some ways, what he does is make primitive and parochial the kind of habits of thought in the Western Academy, rather than to make primitive and parochial the kinds of life systems and world systems that inform and shape and invent the Black radical tradition, right? So in a certain sense, it sort of leaves open the question of, well, what constitutes the primitive? as it sort of embarrasses political science, first and foremost, or as it embarrasses historiography, or as it embarrasses Marxism, right? So I think the question that Christina raises about sort of how to think Cedric as a world systems theorist, I think is a really useful question to think about how we understand, how Cedric understands the world, right? And that's, I think, a pedagogical question. It's also the answer to why, the room at a sala may have not been as full at this time of day, right? So.
I'm going to walk around in the hopes that I can take 2 or 3 more questions. But you'll have to stand up and kind of come to the middle. Yeah, actually.
Okay, well, I don't want to do this, but I guess I will.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you all. I am not that familiar with Cedric Robinson's work, so I will just say that, but I thank you very much for both encouraging me and educating me today. So this is a general question about how Robinson saw, or you all see, the Black radical tradition emerging within the prisons of this country, because there definitely has been some work done on that. I would think more should be done, and so.
Thanks for that. And I'm not afraid to call on people I know. And it was going to be Robin if otherwise, so.
I'm sorry. I actually didn't plan to say anything. I was consciously saying I'm not going to say anything because I feel like I don't want to take up any space. One, this is the very best discussion of anything I've ever seen at any panel. No, I'm just saying that. And I have to say that I'm actually nervous. My heart is racing because moved, beautiful, critical, engaged. I actually want to just respond to the Asala question. I wasn't actually at Asala, and I wish I had gone, although that doesn't surprise me. And specifically, and I would love to hear from the panelists if they could add to this, one of the things that I find dealing with historians, including historians of African American or African diaspora work, including Black historians, is that there is a kind of embarrassment in Black Marxism, not a kind of big embarrassment, of the first section, where he talks about 2 basic things. He's talking about the genesis of racial capitalism, but specifically the way in which racialism, differentiations produced, going back to ancient times, but specifically in feudalism, and he's drawing on Oliver Cox to understand merchant capital, and then his critique of socialism and sort of nationalism, sort of social theory nationalism. In other words, people say, well, why does he begin with Europe? That's about white people, and they'll skip it. Yeah. And they'll say, well, I don't understand that. This is just, I'm just going to skip it and and they don't grasp it all. And Steve and I were talking about this yesterday, just the way in which there's a dismissal of the entire book and of the work as both a work of history and a work of political theory. And instead, people are trying to find the thing that they want. So for some readers, they're trying to find a group of Black Marxists, and they jump to the end. For other readers, they're trying to find, examples of radicalism in the African diaspora. And, so I guess I'm just saying, I'm appealing to people to understand that, to go back to Erica's point, actually, and to Christina's point, actually to everyone's point, that if you see Cedric as someone who shaped the development of world systems theory, who shaped Immanuel Wallerstein's thought, then what he was working through was an understanding that you can't understand the slave trade and the rise of capital unless you go back, and that you need to begin in Europe. So in other words, we got it. For even people who read the book, I'm saying go back to it And I'm also glad you mentioned Lisa Lowe's book, because I think that she actually was really struggling and wrestling with some of these very, very questions. So that's my appeal, to say that if we're, for black scholars, for scholars who do African American history, who meet at Asala, if they're not reading the world, then they're failing, and we're failing, So that was just my little commentary.
Thanks very much for that. Tiffany, if you don't mind coming to the mic. Tiffany Willoughby Herard.
Thank you all so much for this really beautiful panel. And I'm sorry I didn't have the stamina to do the heavy lifting that you all did. So thank you for doing the heavy lifting that you all did today and that you always do. But part of what I want to say in response to the call to reading is that it's actually a lot harder than we think it is. It's actually really, 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 really hard to read. Cognitively, emotionally, affectively, like every kind of way possible, having the time to sit quietly and have people to understand things with you. In some ways, like as somebody who studied with Cedric, I think people benefited more who studied elsewhere than, so close up. Like I understand Cedric much more through Elizabeth than I do, and through Avery than I do through, my direct connection to Cedric himself. And then I understand him more and the scholarship more through practices than through, it took me years and years to be able to understand what the work was offering. And I'm not a poor reader or anything like that. It's just really, really hard work. And so the question of consciousness and the set of practices that are required for somebody like me, they needed to be more embodied. They needed to be more in like the library space or the holding hand space, the communal space in order for me to get it. And so some of those kind of like professionalisms and careerisms, things that make the life of the academy and the life of intellectuals really individualistic, prevent us from being able to transfer the stuff in the work in the ways that most people actually need it. So I'm not talking about it not being accessible. I'm just talking about the other stuff that goes along with reading. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for fantastic questions. Diana, there are many people who are doing work on Black radical thought that has emerged from prisons, and one of the preeminent scholars of this is here today, Avery Gordon, who's writing an amazing book that we all need to read. So finish writing it, Ori, this afternoon. Just go now. And I mean other people too, but I've just encountered Ori's work and it's really fantastic. Yesterday in a panel, Anoop Mipori used two words. They're really basic words for scholars, but I hadn't heard them together to explain something that I needed explaining. He was talking about how he's trying to understand why it is that people, for example, equate slavery with mass incarceration or slave narratives with prison literature. And Anoop said, well, people make an interpretive choice and then disguise that choice as kind of, revealed truths. The second part, those weren't your words, but am I getting the sense of it right? Which is really fantastic. And the interpretive choices that people make about Cedric's work and about the work of what we're calling today the Black radical tradition matter. And so for some people, any kind of radicalism that is, perpetrated by Black people is part of the Black radical tradition. I don't really care. I don't think that saving a label is all that important. But what Cedric was writing about was something actually different, and the difference actually matters because it wasn't, to go back to the very first words that several people used when we started out, the work here is work of critique, not criticism. And we're all really good at criticism and finding the empirical dimensions of all of the oppression that we all know so well. As against critique, which, as I understand it, requires that we make different interpretive choices so that we can track the contradictions more forcefully and fruitfully so that we can do something from the dynamic that holds the contradictions together. Because these mutually constitutive interdependencies are what we're looking at, right? Whether or not we're thinking from something extremely at the margins, which is how prison seems, although in my view it's in the middle of everything, or something that seems more central, like the structure and operation of the contemporary neoliberal university. So that's one set of observations I have in relation to the questions. The other is a more sort of simple and straightforward one, and I'm not accusing anyone of any of this, but I'm accusing everyone of this, and it is that in the United States of America, anti-intellectualism is breathtaking in its scale and scope. Breathtaking, and paid intellectuals are as anti-intellectual as the rest. It's like we express a certain kind of epistemological totality of the United States of America, even if we don't mean to. And so part of the it's hard to read, and I take seriously what you said, Tiffany, and I had to read and reread to get any sense of what I thought I was reading. But part of the problem that we face with all kinds of people is an impatience with thought as part of the practice of liberation. It's like you just get, make an interpretive choice that requires no additional thought and then go for it, and slam the private prisons and we'll all be free, which we won't. Right, so that is also one of the problems, and one of the things that I think we're going to try to do at my center, where I'm the director, not the associate director. That's an old website stuff. We're going to try to put together some consciousness and revolution through education, various kinds of revolutionary education projects, past and present, internationally to try to think this through over the next couple of years. But anti-intellectualism is a huge problem. And related to that, shaped by the racism that Christina was just talking about, is in a lot of the work that is extremely important that's going on in the world, decolonial thought and theory, and I teach in that Barcelona summer school every summer, and I teach Black Marxism, and they won't read it, is a way in which people want to rest assured that they found their theorist, it's usually Anibal Quijano, who was influenced by Cedric at Binghamton, right? And think no more. It's like, I've got my answer. That's another kind of interpretive choice that's a problem.
I've been really struck by the ways in which people are making some of these linkages about mass incarceration and slavery, because I think it bespeaks a bigger problem, a bigger kind of impatience, a bigger kind of fear, a need to have trans-historical answers to every question. I think we're living in perilous times. I think people feel weak. They feel like they're on the back foot, and having an answer that feels big and formidable is powerful, even if it's wrong. So I think one of the things that conditions the way that we think right now is fear, and we have to acknowledge that. But fear's not an excuse not to think. And I think compounding the fear is everything you just laid out, Ruthie and Tiffany, the conditions under which we do this work, under neoliberalism, there are fewer jobs, right? This has a conservatizing effect on what we say, on what we write, on what we publish. There are often times when we think we're radical, where we're actually being very dogmatic. We're radical to the extent as the latest publication said we were allowed to be radical. So, there's a lot of different ways that we have to interrogate. How do we create spaces, like you said, Ruthie, so that we can engage in critique, not just criticism? But I think we have to understand that neoliberalism puts a pressure on us to be able to make ourselves legible in order to get jobs, to reproduce ourselves, to work. And that also conditions what we say and what we think we're able to say. Cedric, talked a lot about the conceit of race, and I think one of the ways this manifests itself in our work is there's a conditioning of who's allowed to say what. So I think if there's anything that circumscribes Cedric's scholarship, it's the fact that he was a Black scholar who wrote some books with the word Black in the title, which sold a lot, and other works that did not have the word black in the title, which didn't sell as much. And this was a point Elizabeth always called our attention to. And so there was, something that I think, I don't know, we should also be mindful about how that conceit plays out in scholarship of who's authorized to say what, on what matter. I just wanted to say this in relationship to the first question about prisons, because in the process of thinking through Cedric's work, I think it's helped clarify for me a point that Ori Burton made the other day, which is that we have to stop thinking about the prison as a discrete external site. We have to be able to think about the prison as a set of relations. I think this is a Robinsonian kind of analysis that I think opens up other kinds of critiques that are urgent and essential at this moment.
Yeah, I guess, Tiffany, to your point, one of the reasons why I kind of just wanted to open up a space to talk about Cedric's people is because I was trying to say something about the social life of his work, which is also about the difficulty of his work. And so, there's in that thing that Fred wrote for you guys, he talks about, how the work used to circulate in a sort of underground fashion until Robin prefaced the republication in 2000, et cetera. And I think that one of the things that I didn't really know how difficult Cedric's work was until I tried to teach it in my Intro to Africana Studies class, to freshmen, And my colleague Stefan and I made the choice to start with Black Marxism because we couldn't figure where else to start that class, right? So there, like beyond the question of difficulty was just the necessity, right? What else can we say without doing this work first, right? So, so I think there's something about the kind of the way that the work teaches us in excess of itself. It demands a social life, right? You can't get it on your own, right? And that's what's key, I think, so. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add to any of this other than to say that, yeah, I have been teaching Cedric's work for a long time, including to many people in this room, and it's something about the practice of collective learning, but also the practice of who and what you care about and how you're living your life that makes the book legible or not. This is, I think, something really crucial that makes it easier to read the work. In other words, that all to say that, Cedric is on the one hand doing theory through historical method, which he is doing in all the books except for terms of order, is also, I think, to miss the element of it that is understanding that he's thinking always in terms of the social struggles, the efforts of ordinary people. That's who he cares about. And the attention to the intellectuals is an attention to whether or not they are doing the work that they need to be doing. And so this is what the work is all about. And to read it, to engage with it, to take from it is to accept that this is its basic demand on you. And I think that there are the kinds of, if you like, intellectual, critical questions that I think might be more difficult to discuss here today. What is Cedric's relationship to world systems theory? That's maybe a conversation to have, or the extent to which Cold War thinking and then the post-'89 period impacts all kinds of things, including the decision to write a book to recuperate socialism at a moment in which it is declared dead, and so on and so forth. I mean, these are the kinds of engagement with the work that at least I hope that the renewed attention to him will help people do, and then folks will take it whichever way they want. I think that one of the most accessible pieces of Cedric's writing, for those of you who want to start, is the preface to Forgeries, in which he, at the, the last published book that he wrote, he tried to articulate in a way about as clear as you're going to get from him, what his notion of a racial regime was, how he understood racial capitalism, and to some extent the general methodology for how he proceeded. I think it's short. That's a good start. And that everyone in this room who's reading it and teaching it, I mean, maybe what we need is some pedagogical seminars of how to teach the work. There are lots of folks who have experience with that and can share that out. But I think the crucial thing is, what is the life you are leading? What are your own political identifications and commitments? How are you thinking in relationship to the things that the world and those social struggles are throwing up for you? That's what he did in, the quiet, and to some extent, domain of Goleta, California. I mean, where there wasn't a lot of this stuff going on.